guys, so we are live again. Welcome to the second week where we're doing a study called SO3 Spiritually Oriented times 3, where we're asking ourselves the three basic orienting questions of life. Do we know who we are, where we are, and what time it is? But we're looking at it from a little bit different angle, not just from a biological perspective to see if we're conscious or not, but if we're fully awake to both who we are as persons and who God is and our place in the world and how we relate to God in the world. And so last week was the first week. If you guys got to tune in, I appreciate that. If not, I think you can find it in my on my wall there in my profile on Facebook, and kind of revisit that, where we looked at this idea of personal identity. And we're going to dive, if you missed it, that's fine. We're going to build on that a little bit this week, and then next week we're going to the third question, what time it is. We're going to be thinking based upon what we've learned about ourselves from the first week of our identity, and the second week the culture that we're in and the place that we're in, then what time is it for us? So there's some things that maybe we should stop in order to start new things, and what can we actually do to apply some of the insight that we've been learning. So today, though, we're asking that same question: do we know where we are? And there's two different ways I want us to think about this during our time. I'm going to try to keep it brief, 30 minutes like last time, so bear with me as we go through this. The first, when we're thinking about where are we, is I want us to think about our perspective on the world. There's really two ways of looking at this idea of where we are. Of course, there's a long discussion here, but we don't have that much time. So the two things I want to focus on, number one, is us thinking to ourselves, how do we perceive, or how do we see the world? This is sometimes called a worldview, a person's worldview. What's a worldview? Well, there are different analogies that you can use to think about it. Some people use like a pair of glasses. So you used to say that those who are in love, they see the other person through rose-colored glasses, or they only see a certain side of the person that they want to see sometimes because they really love, or maybe you're even infatuated with that person. And so we all have a worldview. We all have a way of seeing the world that has different, that consists of our values, the things that we assign value to, our desires, our beliefs, and also what we believe about the past, the present, the future, how we see ourselves and others. So all these things kind of work into worldview. To illustrate, I'm going to read a passage from Scripture. Okay, so this is from the book of Mark, and we're going to start with chapter 4, verse 36. And here's the scene. Jesus is here teaching with his disciples, and he's about to give them a real hands-on lesson. Verse 35, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side of a lake that he had been, the other side of the sea that he had been teaching around. Verse 36, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. Verse 37, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him up and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Verse 39, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and everything was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they were terrified and asked each other, Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Now I know in this particular passage it can be easy for us to focus on this great miracle that Jesus performs here. But what I want to look at is the different ways that the disciples and Jesus approach the same circumstances. So they're in the same situation. They're in a boat. They're out on the Sea of Galilee. There's waves. They're in a storm. One of them is completely calm. He's taking a nap. The others are terrified. They're afraid. And partly it's because they saw the world and they saw their circumstances. Even though they were in the same circumstances, they saw those completely differently. And Jesus had a certain belief system, a certain way of seeing this world as a God-made world, where he knew that he was in control of, that he was in a safe place, that he could actually have power over the circumstances and situation, whereas the disciples didn't quite know exactly who they were in the boat with at this time. And so it's easy to see how our beliefs and the things that how we see the world can directly affect our circumstances, and sometimes our circumstances can then in turn affect our beliefs. So these two things work together in a way. So there's 4 different ways, and the first question that I want you guys to kind of write down to think about after this, and that if you want to join us on Wednesday for our Zoom small group that we'll be going over, is just this: what is your worldview? And there's 4 different ways or categories that I'm going to give you now so that you can kind of think about it as you write it down. Number 1 is origin. What do you think of when you think about your origin? What we talked about last week: are we made in the image of God? Are we persons who have value and inherent worth? Where do we come from? And it could also mean your own personal origin. So how your family culture plays a part of this, whether you may be from a different descent. Like, for instance, my grandmother was fresh off the boat from Ireland, 100% Irish, and so there's certain parts of that in my history. There could be certain parts in your history, in your origin. Number 2 is meaning. How do you define what is meaningful and valuable in your life? What is it that gets you up in the morning? What is your why for the things that you do, right? So origin, meaning. Next is morality. Think about the things that you think are good. What are the rules of life that you live by? What is it, you think about your own integrity and the kind of code of ethics that you want to live up to. It doesn't mean you always live up to them perfectly, because none of us really do. But still, we all have a value system in terms of our ethics. And then finally, destiny. Where do you see this world going? Where do you see your final end going? Because there's a key here to think about. Oftentimes, how we see and perceive the future, how we think the future is going to be, will oftentimes affect the way that we live now in the present. That just makes good sense, right? So these 4 things are actually parts of a worldview. They're not original with me. They come from Ravi Zacharias and some of his writings. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Write those down. Come back and review it later. Okay, so next, what I want us to do now is to think about a couple of different ways that in our world we are surrounded by big overarching worldview themes. Okay, so me, if I'm a follower of Jesus, then I want to have a Christian worldview. So when I think about those answers of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, I want to be informed about that through Scripture. This is my authority. But I'm going to have other influences too. Tim Keller basically says there are 3 reasons why people believe or disbelieve anything. They have personal reasons, so these are personal experiences that we have. There's intellectual reasons, so these are things that we think and reason out in our own minds. And then social reasons, so these are things that we just find ourselves drawn to because we have an affinity with a certain group. And so you might think, well, this person or that person thinks this way, I want to be in with them, so I'm going to believe this. Or you may say, I'd like to be in with that group, but my mind just won't let me. I can't go there. A lot of people feel this way about Christianity. Maybe they'd love to believe in a good God who loves them, but there's something else that trips them up. Maybe this miracle story, for example. So they have these intellectual issues. Or possibly there's a personal reason that you believe or disbelieve something. You've had an experience. And sometimes those personal experiences can actually trump the intellectual or the social beliefs. So these 3 work in tension, and we all have certain varying degrees where they come into play with us in our lives. Okay, but so we want to have, or for me, I want to have a Christian worldview, a Christian outlook. But there are other worldviews out there that we're coming into play with constantly. Okay? In fact, this is one of the things that the Bible means when it says the word world, that we have these 3 enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil. And it's confusing because in Scripture, the term world, or cosmos, actually has a couple different meanings. Number 1, it can mean, in like John 3:16, for God so loved the world, the cosmos, which in this verse implies that world means basically the human, like humanity encompassing the earth. You know, that this is the world, just the basic idea of cosmos. So it's this ordered reality that God has set in motion that has humans there as part of it. This is the reason why we're told that God sent His Son, that He came to renew and to redeem and to save us, because He loved us before we did anything for Him. Before we move back to Him, He wants to rescue and redeem, because we are those made in His image. So that's one use of world. Another use of world, though, that's used in Scripture is this idea of fortresses or worldviews that are set up against God. Okay, organized kind of systems of injustice or false beliefs, or things that tear down or limit or hurt people's confidence in God and cause people to harm or to inflict harm on others. So that's another use of world. I'm going to read two different quotes here from two different perspectives that would be antagonistic, let's say, to a Christian worldview. But these are other options for how people see the world that they inhabit, that they live in. The first is what might be called scientific naturalism, or you could put another ism, atheistic scientific naturalism. Depends on how you want to label that. But this is from a guy named Dawkins, and this is what Dawkins has to say. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no other good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's from his book, Out of Eden. So this is a person's worldview that says who we are, where we came from, where we're going, and what it is that we can actually know about this world, which is basically a world limited to our senses, an empirically verified world, and that's it. What we can see, taste, touch, smell, just those things we can study and observe and replicate in science. So that's one idea and an example. Another one is called moral therapy. I'm going to call it moral therapeutic deism, after another author, Kendra Casey Dean, who's a sociologist. And what she's looked at a lot is the basic kind of what she calls the American civil religion, the new American civil religion. And basically, what this is, moral therapeutic deism, it kind of defines itself in that phrase. It sees the universe as being here, kind of deistically. Yeah, God's out there somewhere. He created us, and that's a good thing. But He doesn't have actual involvement with our lives. There's the deism part, right? But He wants us to be good. He wants us to treat people right, and as best as we can do, as long as we don't harm anyone else, right? That's kind of the main ethic of moral therapeutic deism. And then the therapeutic part, that ultimately what God wants is for us to be happy. So think of kind of like a genie God in the sky, or perhaps a good old grandfatherly God in the sky, who is quick to give us gifts but doesn't ask much of us in return. And so these two worldviews are at odds with Christianity, are at odds with the way that Jesus described His world, and the way that Christian teaching historically has viewed who we are, where we're going, what it means to be a good person, etc. All right, so question again for you to think about. What are some of the worldviews that people share in your circle of influence? Okay, so think about some of your closest friends, because hopefully we have friends that don't agree with us, that don't see that we don't see eye to eye with, but that doesn't stop us from caring about them, from interacting with them, from serving and loving them. And so we could have some very good, I've some very good friends of mine, who we clash on politically, or we clash on religiously in certain ways. But yet there's other things that we have in common that bring us together, and we're able to live in this pluralistic world that we have. And that's a good thing. That's a Christian value, actually, is that we can have freedom of conscience, where we give that other person, because they're made in the image of God just like we are, we give that person value and realize that we can't force beliefs on anyone. That's just a good way to live in the pluralistic world that we have, that we imbibe in, is this idea of humility. Not that we hold our beliefs loosely, not that we don't have our convictions, but that we have enough humility to recognize the limitations that we might have in imposing our convictions or our beliefs on another person. We want to be able to seek first to understand them before we are understood. But think about that, and that can kind of help you if you start seeing through a worldview lens. It can help you start to see the different people around you that form your social, connections, that form your social world, and then you can start seeing how this kind of plays out and really affects everyday life. Worldviews are kind of like health in this way. We often don't think about them until they break down, right? That's when we think about our health. Is when we get sick. And so, in the same way, when something comes into our world that we're not ready for, and that something unexplained happens for one of those personal, intellectual, or social reasons, now oftentimes we have to adjust and move and work on those worldviews. So that's enough worldview talk. The next I want us to think about, as it relates to this in a broader umbrella term, is our culture. So we live, again, we just said it a couple times, a pluralistic culture, which just means that there are many worldviews underneath this one place, this one area that we live in here in America. And we kind of lost as a nation what might be called a unified culture. Don't have time to get into this super deeply, but if you think about it, let's say 60 to 80 years ago, there was a certain ethos that America kind of had. For one thing, there's only 4 TV stations. There's no internet. There's no mass. There's no way that people can be as mobile or as connected as they are. In some ways, there were connecting channels, but those connecting channels were much wider and fewer. And so what that allowed people to do was that people oftentimes, they got their information from the same sources, or one of 2 sources. Whereas today, there's all kinds of information. We have information overload in a lot of ways. And the cultures that we inhabit, that we imbibe, in some ways are more similar. They have certain characteristics that are more similar, but in other ways they can be very, very different. You can have a big mix in places. I went and traveled when I was working for a national fraternity, Alpha Tau Omega. I was one of their national leadership consultants, and so I actually went through about 40 states in 4 years. And this is right from 2000, 2003. So the internet was just kind of getting going. We had cell phones, but I still remember getting out my atlas in my car so that I could know, which turns to go on to navigate around the country. I didn't have, which, man, I could imagine that would have been so much easier to just have, Google Maps back then. But anyways, it would be fascinating, because I would go from Delaware, University of Delaware, or New Hampshire, all the way to the West Coast, to UCLA, in the same month. And the students there were very different. They looked different in some ways. There was more homogeneity in certain places, say in Texas, than there was at a place like UC Berkeley here. And so, there's definitely different cultures, even here, as a large a place as the United States is. However, there's also, if I was to go back now on those different campuses, there's a certain thing of campus culture. So that the University of Texas in Austin, there's probably more things that people have in common there at that university that with people all the way out in LA, let's say UCLA, than about 10 minutes down the road in Austin and some of the outlying, farmlands or countryside or whatever. Same thing here in Alabama. University of Alabama has a certain culture. And so it's interesting for us to think about what are the different values and beliefs and things that kind of come in and create the ebb and flow that we live in. Because we as persons, we're not just autonomous selves, right? You know, we actually, we can create culture in a way, we talked about this last week, where we talk about how we have this cultural mandate where we're created in the image of God, and then we are told to go out and to govern and to create and to do something, cultivate what God has already created and given to us to do as stewards. But in a way, not only do we make culture, but culture can then turn around and influence and shape us in significant ways. And what I want to do here with the time that we have is to think about how one particular aspect shapes the way that we view ourselves and possibly how we interact with other people, because that's what this is all about. So worldview is our first point. This next point, as we're looking and diving into the kind of culture that we live in, we're going to focus on how we form our identity in our particular context in our culture today. And there's two different ways historically that people have formed identity within their culture. Number one is let's call it a communal culture. More ancient cultures had this way. Also, today certain Asian cultures are very much like this. They're closed context. They're very group-oriented, group thinking. I remember I got to go on a 9-week trip to Thailand right before I graduated from college. It was so interesting to me because when I was there visiting with my Thai friends, and I would ask them, you know, so what do you like about this particular thing? They would almost always answer, well, we Thai people, we like this, or we Thai people, we think this. And it was always this we above a me. Whereas if you were to, if I was to ask myself, or my friends were to ask me or them, say, you know, why do you like this? I said, well, I like this because of that. And you like something different for another reason, right? And so this is one easy way of seeing more of a communal culture than, let's say, more individualistic culture. Another thing about closed context, more communal cultures, is that people tend to bring value to themselves and meaning by how they observe and how they give honor to those who within the culture that they're at. So in other words, there's this sense of family and honor and community, and that goes above their own individual desires or beliefs sometimes. And so if you can think about this, it's that these certain cultures are that your worth and your sense of self is developed as you move out toward others, assuming roles in your family and community, often sacrificing yourself and your own desires for the good of the group. Now, we live and move and breathe in a world that's not communally driven like that. And so for this, I'm going to use some insights from a guy named Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is a Canadian philosopher, intellectual. One of his most famous books is just called The Secular Age, if you want to look him up. And I'm going to use him and another sociologist, Robert Bellow, to kind of chart a bit of a course in how we got to where we are in our individualism, not just individualism, but kind of hyper-individualism that we are currently living and breathing in. Okay, so pre-World War II, according to Taylor, thinkers like John Locke and others came up with these ideas of consent of the governed. In other words, this is a political theory, a political individualism that tried to make sure that everyone had a vote and a say, and there should be political equality in our society. But then, if you fast forward to World War II, according to Taylor, beforehand, we put an emphasis on individual rights. This was a big part of the American dream and our Bill of Rights and the image of God. A lot of these Judeo-Christian values are actually birthed in this. However, before World War II, these rights had certain boundaries. You had family, you had God. You had other different limiting factors or circumstances that tend to curtail and keep these rights and tensions. So you not only had rights, you also had responsibilities. And there was a tension that was maintained here a little bit more thoroughly than what we have today. And so after World War II, though, Taylor says that individualism became absolutized. And there was a move from political individualism to expressive individualism. This is how Robert Bellah describes expressive individualism in his book, Habits of the Heart. He says, our culture does not believe we learn or become who we really are by sublimating our individual needs for those of the community or family. Rather, each person has a unique core of feeling and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if identity is to be realized. He calls this expressive individualism. And it is in the air we breathe, the water we swim in, and every Disney princess theme song. Okay, so I not to hate on Disney per se or Disney princesses, because I'm pretty sure my daughter knows the words to every one of these. But I can't help but bring out this one line from Frozen 1. I actually really like Frozen 2 for a lot of different reasons, but Frozen 1 in the song Let It Go, and believe me, I'm not going to sing for you because that would totally ensure you would never come back to this. But this is what it says. It's time to see what I can do to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. Right? This idea of the individual and their freedom, and that this freedom, not just a freedom for or freedom to be a certain kind of person or thing, but a freedom from rules, from restraint, from authority. There's two different ways of looking at freedom, right? One, Lord Acton, I believe, who said, freedom is not the ability to do whatever one wants, but the ability to do what they know is right to do. In other words, true freedom isn't just anarchy. It's not a world with no limitations, but it's finding the right limitations for you. G.K. Chesterton once said, be careful that when you free a tiger, that you only free it from its cage. You don't want to free it from its stripes, or else it ceases being a tiger. The point is that we as human beings, to be truly free is not to be just totally limitless in our freedom, but it's to find the right limits by which we can truly fulfill our human nature and calling and design. And so, now there's a big discussion here, obviously, but you get where Bella's point here is that if we move into this world of expressive individualism and we define ourselves solely by our desires, when those desires come into conflict with someone else's desires, or when our desires don't get met, or we don't get that affirmation from others, then we are setting ourselves up for a kind of identity that can end up just crushing us and enslaving us. Not to the good, but to just however our desires happen to be shaped. Okay, so why did this happen? We don't have much time to go into this, so basically I'm just going to say this. Think material prosperity. As people became more and more prosperous and more mobile, people now had private space and means to fill it. So televisions replaced front porches where everybody used to sit around and talk. If you think about just the architecture today, most of the time we drive into the back of the house and around into the garage, right? You see certain communities now that are trying to fight against this individualistic trend. They're trying to build communities that represent more of kind of like a Mayberry, Andy Griffith type feel, where people are out on their porches, and they're communicating and sharing more things communally to help one another along. But if you live in a world that's prosperous and that's mobile, and you don't need necessarily the help of others, then you set yourself up for the ability to become more and more individualistic. And then you have the marketing machine that we have. So the best way to sell a product is to appeal to individual tastes and desires. So you can tell the world what kind of person you are by what brand it is that you're wearing, or the car it is that you're driving. So consumerism and materialism have a tendency to individualize, and to individualize absolutely. And so eventually what happens in this hyper materialistic individual world, even the transactions and exchanges between individuals, we start to see other people as commodities. And as the old saying goes, time is money. Everything tends to be viewed that way. Something to be consumed, something to think of, okay, what can I do? What can this person do for me? As opposed to, what can I give? What can I build up? How can we relate and connect together? To close out, I think it's been interesting how we are living in a time right now because of COVID, because of the way our world has changed in a lot of ways, how we see this tension between individualism and collectivism kind of coming together. And I want to say this real quick as we close. There are some definite good aspects to focus on the individual. At times, groupthink or some of those more traditional cultures can be stifling. They could be oppressive, and individual freedoms can be sacrificed. I mentioned things like human rights that have sprung from the soul of a biblical doctrine of the image of God, combined with the Western notion of individual freedom and responsibility, and how good that these rights are. However, the point is that we need to keep these things in balance and attention. Just like a tightrope walker, the tension of the rope helps the tightroper stay on playing. It's easier to fall on one side or the other. And what's been interesting as I've been watching this and watching our different responses to the current crisis is how easy it is to go from one extreme to the other in our responses. Even in my own life, my own responses, how I've gone back and forth, and how I felt that tension between my individual rights and freedoms and what I want to do versus feeling the need to protect others and to think collectively. And I'm not saying which is right and which is wrong. There's just a big discussion to go on here to see how we are handling this, and even experts disagree. So, but my point is that as we're thinking about the culture that we're in, we can see through these different lenses to start evaluating, critiquing, just noticing, being more aware of the messages that we're getting from the marketing or from movies or whatever it is. We start being kind of cultural connoisseurs of the ideas and the worldviews and the people around us, and how they shape us, and how they form our desires and our loves and our hearts, and how we move towards those things even subconsciously, right? Okay, that's enough, and we're past time, so I apologize for taking a few more minutes than I did last time, but this is a big topic, big discussion. We're going to keep going into this and finish up on Wednesday. Please post something for me. Let me know if you'd like to check in, to sign up for that Zoom meeting on Wednesday night. The three things I'd like for you to remember: number one, talk about your own worldview. How would you define your origin, meaning, morality, and destiny? Number two, think about the people around you and the worldviews that you come in contact with from persons. And number three, this last thing, that may be a little bit more abstract, think about the certain messages that you think our culture sends to us. Think about how we form our own sense of identity and worth. If it's individualistic, if it's more collectivist, think about the different messages that we hear politically or from marketing, and think about the world that you inhabit. Because here's the reality: we don't have just one culture anymore. We have many cultures, and so I can't answer this question for you. This is something that you have to think and wrestle with, and begin to see and have your eyes open to, and become more awake to know where it is that you are in your world, and how you see the world, and how other pressures around the world are pushing you or pulling you to see it with them. So that's my take. That's my challenge for this week. And please tune in next Sunday night, 7 o'clock, for the question, what time is it? So thanks, y'all. Have a good Sunday.